Stagira sat on the Chalcidic peninsula like a small lamp in a large room. It was not one of the great cities. It had no particular reputation for philosophy, no famous stoa where arguments gathered and grew old, no harbor busy enough to attract the traders of ideas who moved between Athens and Corinth and the islands of the Aegean. It was a provincial place, rocky and pine-scented, set along the northeastern coast of Greece, where the land reaches out in 3 fingers toward the sea. And it was here, around the year 384 BCE, that a child was born into a household shaped by the close and patient study of living bodies. His father's name was Nicomachus. He served as physician to the Macedonian court, which meant that the work of careful observation, the pressing of fingers against a patient's side, the noting of color and breath, and the slow or rapid progress of recovery was not a strange or elevated activity in the house where Aristotle grew up. It was ordinary. It was what the adults around him did. Medicine in the ancient world was not yet the rigorously codified discipline it would become, but it was already an empirical practice, one that rewarded the person who looked carefully and recorded honestly over the person who simply held strong opinions about how things ought to be. A physician's child learns early that the world does not always conform to expectation, and that the body in particular will tell you what it is doing if you are willing to be still and attend to it. Nicomachus died when Aristotle was still young, before his son was old enough to follow him into that work, in any formal sense. But something of the physician's disposition appears to have settled into the boy, some inclination toward the concrete and the observable, toward the thing itself, rather than the idea of the thing. The habits of a household form a child before any teacher does. By the time Aristotle was ready to leave Stagira for the wider world, the wide world he was most drawn to was not the world of abstractions contemplated in a quiet room, but the world of actual things, actual organisms, actual bodies going about the business of being alive. He was approximately 17 years old when he made the journey south to Athens. The date most often given is around 367 BCE, during the long archonship of that city, and during the later years of Plato's Academy, which had been established in the grove of Academos, just outside the city's walls, some 20 years before. For a young man from northern Greece with a serious mind and some means, Athens was still the place where philosophy happened most intensely, most publicly, most consequentially, and the academy was its center. The road south from Macedonia into Attica was not a short one. The young man from Stagira would have passed through landscapes that looked nothing like the shaded walkways and polished arguments he was traveling toward, stony hillsides, the occasional olive grove already old and thickening in its trunk, in small settlements where the people went about, lives that philosophy had not yet touched. What he carried with him on that road was the question of what a serious mind was for. He had grown up watching a careful man observe the world and draw careful conclusions from what he saw. He was about to enter a community organized around a very different idea of what careful thinking produced. Plato's Academy was a place of extraordinary intellectual vitality. It had attracted some of the best minds of the Greek world, and Plato himself, then in his early 60s, was still teaching, still developing the views that had been accumulating through the great middle dialogues and were now reaching their late systematic form. The doctrine at the center of his teaching held that the visible world, the world of bodies and objects and animals going about their business, was not the most real world. Beneath or behind or above it, the spatial metaphors were always a little awkward. There existed a realm of eternal, unchanging, non-material entities, the forms. The form of beauty was not any beautiful thing, but the thing that made beautiful things beautiful. The form of justice was not any just act, but the principle in virtue of which just acts were just. These forms were the truly real. The world the senses reported was a flickering approximation, a world of copies and shadows and impermanent instances, knowable only in the approximate and provisional way that shadows are knowable, not in the direct and certain way that eternal objects were knowable to the rational soul in its purest operation. For Plato, this conviction was not merely a metaphysical position held at a comfortable distance from lived experience. It shaped everything. It shaped his account of knowledge, which he distinguished sharply from mere opinion by insisting that genuine knowledge required an eternal, unchanging object. It shaped his account of the soul, which he understood as something fundamentally separate from the body, and more akin in its nature to the eternal forms than to the perishable flesh it temporarily inhabited. It shaped his political philosophy, which assigned the governance of the city to those whose souls had been most thoroughly trained in the apprehension of the eternal. The forms were not one doctrine among others in Plato's teaching. They were the load-bearing structure of the entire edifice. Aristotle spent nearly 20 years inside that edifice. He was a student of unusual ability, and Plato appears to have recognized this, calling him the mind of the school, or so later accounts suggested. 20 years is a long time, long enough to absorb the arguments so thoroughly that their internal logic becomes second nature, long enough also to begin noticing where the structure puts weight it cannot quite bear. The disagreement that was forming in Aristotle during those years was not the disagreement of a pupil who has not fully understood his teacher, or of a young man impatient to distinguish himself from the person who formed him. It ran deeper than that. It was a disagreement about where reality was located. Plato had looked at the world of changing, perishing, impermanent things, and had concluded that the philosophical impulse was necessarily an impulse away from this world, toward the eternal and the unchanging, toward the objects of pure rational contemplation that the sensory world could only gesture toward imperfectly. Aristotle had looked at the same world, the world of living bodies and growing plants and animals engaged in the business of their lives, and found in it something that did not feel like a shadow or an approximation. It felt like the thing itself. This is not to say that the disagreement was sharp or sudden or hostile. The Academy was not that kind of place, and Aristotle was not that kind of person. He spoke of Plato, even after years of argument against his central claims, with genuine respect, acknowledging the debt while marking the distance. There is a passage sometimes attributed to him, though its exact form varies across different reports, in which he acknowledges that while Plato was dear to him, the truth was dearer. Whether or not those were his precise words, the sentiment captures something real about the relationship, sustained, serious, philosophical love that does not require agreement. Plato died in 347 BCE. Aristotle was then in his late 30s, a mature philosopher who had spent almost half his life inside the institution his teacher had built. He did not remain. Whether the decision was primarily philosophical or political or personal, the new leadership of the Academy had passed to Speusippus, Plato's nephew, and there were tensions there. The effect was to free Aristotle from the institutional context that had shaped him and to send him out into a world he was increasingly inclined to study directly, rather than theorize about from a distance. The years that followed Plato's death were years of genuine intellectual wandering, in both the literal and the more meaningful sense. Aristotle traveled with his student and colleague Theophrastus to Ossos, on the coast of Asia Minor, where he spent several years under the patronage of a local ruler named Hermias, whose niece he married. From Ossos, he moved to the island of Lesbos, where the diversity of marine life in the shallow waters of the island's sheltered harbor provided him with material for the biological investigations that would eventually become some of the most remarkable and detailed natural science produced before the modern era. He spent time on the Macedonian coast as well, where Philip II invited him to serve as tutor to a young prince who would later be known as Alexander. These years produced something that could not have been produced inside the academy, even in its most intellectually generous moments. They produced an Aristotle who had handled specimens, who had cut open bodies to observe how the organs were arranged and how they functioned together, who had spent enough time watching actual organisms in actual environments to develop what might be called a naturalist's respect for the particular. The fish he studied in the waters around Lesbos were not illustrations of philosophical points. They were individual, specific, describable creatures with their own ways of feeding and breeding and moving through the world. The discipline of attending to them with care, of looking and noting and returning and looking again, was itself a kind of philosophy, even before the arguments were assembled. By 335 BCE, Aristotle had returned to Athens. He was now 50 years old, or very close to it. The city he came back to was not quite the same as the one he had left. The political landscape of Greece had shifted significantly under Macedonian pressure. Athens was no longer the fully independent city it had been, and the presence of a Macedonian connection in a philosopher's biography was not an uncomplicated thing. But the intellectual life of the city continued, and Aristotle established himself in a different part of it from the academy, in a precinct sacred to Apollo Lykios, the Lyceum, where he founded the school that would bear the name of the place. The Lyceum was something different from the academy in character, even if the two institutions shared certain broad commitments to rigorous philosophical inquiry. Where the academy had been organized primarily around the ascent toward the eternal, the training of philosophical vision toward objects that transcended the sensory world, the Lyceum was organized around the accumulation and systematic organization of knowledge about the world as it actually presented itself to careful inquiry. Logic, natural philosophy, biology, rhetoric, politics, psychology, ethics. These were not for Aristotle separate disciplines that happened to coexist in one institution. They were connected investigations of a single unified reality, each requiring the others, none fully intelligible in isolation from the rest. Tumulting. There is an image that attached itself to Aristotle's teaching at the Lyceum that has come down through the centuries with perhaps more persistence than any other. The image of the peripatetic philosopher, the one who teaches while walking, the covered walkways of the school, the peripatos from which the tradition took its name, provided a sheltered space where thinking and movement could occur together, where the walking and the talking were not separate activities, but expressions of a single, restless, patient, forward-moving attention. Whether Aristotle actually did his teaching primarily on those walkways, or whether the name attached to his school, for other reasons entirely, is a question the historical record does not settle with certainty. But the image persists because it captures something true about the kind of philosophy he practiced, not the seated, upward-gazing contemplation of eternal truths, but the slow ambulatory accumulation of observations about the world encountered at ground level. The school he built was not only a place for philosophical disputation, it was also a library, a museum of natural specimens, a place where research was conducted in what would be called today an institutional rather than a purely individual mode. Theophrastus, who would succeed Aristotle as head of the Lyceum, was already doing systematic work on plants. Others were engaged in collecting and comparing constitutions of various Greek city-states, an empirical political science that required the gathering and organization of actual historical and political material rather than the derivation of political truths from first philosophical principles. The Lyceum was, in this sense, the first institution in Western intellectual history, organized around the idea that knowledge is built up through the patient accumulation of observed particulars, rather than arrived at through the ascent to universal truths that transcend the particular. The writings that survive from Aristotle represent only a portion of what he produced. The works that have come down to us, the Organon, which collects his writings on logic, the physics, the metaphysics, the De Anima, his treatise on the soul, the Nicomachean ethics, the politics, the poetics, the biological writings, including the Historia Animalium and the De Generation Animalium. These were, in the view of most scholars, lecture notes or working documents rather than the polished dialogues he also wrote, and which are almost entirely lost. The philosophical dialogues that Aristotle composed for wider circulation, works that ancient readers praised for their eloquence, and that apparently showed the influence of Plato's literary style, survived through antiquity, but did not survive the centuries that followed. What we have instead are the technical treatises, compressed and dense, written for an audience already engaged in the work of the Lyceum, rather than for the educated general reader. The history of how those treatises reached the form in which we now read them is a long and sometimes murky one. After Aristotle's death in 322 BCE, the Lyceum continued under Theophrastus, and then under a succession of other heads, but the school gradually lost the intellectual force of its founding. The treatises passed into various hands, were reportedly stored in difficult conditions for some centuries, and eventually reached an editor named Andronicus of Rhodes, who is generally credited with organizing them into the form in which they circulated through the later ancient world. From there they traveled into the Neoplatonic tradition, where they were studied and commented upon, often in the service of philosophical agendas quite different from Aristotle's own. The most consequential chapter in the afterlife of those texts came through the Islamic philosophical tradition, as the intellectual heritage of ancient Greece was absorbed and extended by Arab scholars in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. Aristotle's writings were translated into Arabic and became the subject of sustained philosophical commentary. Ibn Rushd, known in the Latin West as Averroes, produced a series of commentaries on the Aristotelian corpus, so comprehensive and authoritative that later Latin readers came to call him simply the commentator, not a commentator, but the commentator, as though the role had been definitively filled. Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, integrated Aristotelian psychology with Neoplatonic metaphysics in ways that would generate centuries of philosophical argument. These were not merely custodians, passing text forward unchanged. They were philosophers engaging with Aristotle's arguments on their own terms, extending them, challenging them, finding in them resources for questions Aristotle himself had not posed. When the texts re-entered European intellectual life in the 12th and 13th centuries through the translation movements in Spain and Sicily, through the recovery of lost manuscripts, through the intensive philosophical activity of the newly founded universities, they arrived not simply as ancient Greek documents, but as works that had already been through one major cycle of philosophical commentary and transformation. The medieval scholastics who encountered them, Thomas Aquinas among the most significant, were reading an Aristotle who had already been read by Avicenna and Averroes, whose arguments had already been worked and reworked in a tradition that extended across several centuries and several languages. There is an image worth dwelling with for a moment. A scholar in a scriptorium somewhere in Northern Europe, a century or so after the translation movement had begun bringing these texts into Latin, encountering for the first time a passage from the De Anima in a freshly made copy. The room is quiet in the way that rooms are quiet in the deep of night when the rest of the community has gone to sleep. The candle makes a small circle of light. The Latin is careful, slightly formal, carrying faint traces of the Arabic it was translated from, and the Greek that preceded the Arabic. The scholar reads a sentence about the soul, reads it again, pauses with it. Something in the definition, the soul as a kind of form, as the organizing principle that makes a living body what it is, does not sit where he expected it to sit. It is not the soul he had grown up understanding, not the soul as a separate spiritual substance waiting to depart for its true home. It is something more intimate than that, more entangled with the body, more present somehow in the very activity of being alive. He reads the sentence a third time. The candle continues. Outside the scriptorium, the night holds still, as it always does, around whatever thinking is being done inside it. The difficulty of the ideas, and those ideas were genuinely difficult, not in the obscurantist way of writing that hides behind difficulty, but in the honest way of thinking that has pushed past easy formulation, did not prevent them from spreading. Within a generation or two of their arrival in the Latin West, Aristotle's works had moved from the edges of acceptable intellectual inquiry, where some church authorities had initially regarded them with suspicion, to the center of the university curriculum, the Nicomachean Ethics, the Physics, the De Anima. These became the standard texts around which intellectual formation was organized at the major European universities. The philosopher, as Thomas Aquinas called him, using the definite article in the same way Latin readers called Averroes the commentator, the philosopher had effectively become the intellectual framework within which educated Europeans thought. This is worth noticing not because it represents triumph or culmination, the story of how any body of thought becomes institutionally dominant is always more complicated and more contingent than the retrospective narrative of intellectual progress suggests, but because it marks the beginning of something important, a sustained and serious encounter between the systematic empirical philosophy Aristotle had developed in the Lyceum and the Christian theological tradition that had shaped European thought for centuries. That encounter produced some of the most intricate and careful philosophical work of the medieval period, and it produced also some of the most fundamental tensions in the history of Western thought, tensions that have not resolved themselves even now. But all of that comes later, and much later. The young man from Stagira, walking south toward Athens in the year 367 BCE, knows nothing of Averroes or Aquinas or the university at Paris. He carries with him the habits of a physician's household and a mind inclined toward the careful observation of living things. The road is long, and the season, as best as can be reckoned, is spring, when the hillsides of Macedonia and Thessaly would have been green in a way they are not, in summer, when the light falls at the oblique angle that makes everything look as though it is just about to be understood. He will spend 20 years in the house his teacher built, learning to think from within a framework he will eventually find insufficient. He will leave that house not in anger, but in the kind of quiet seriousness that belongs to a person who has decided that the most important thing is to get the question right. He will travel along coasts and through islands and through years of patient observation. He will return to Athens and build something new on ground adjacent to what he had left. He will write, or dictate, or set down in whatever form the treatises took in their original composition, works that will outlast every political arrangement of his era, and most of the intellectual arrangements as well. The Lyceum, as he established it in 335 BCE, was not primarily a monument or a legacy. It was a working institution. Animals were brought in from the surrounding countryside and from the Aegean to be observed and described. Political documents were gathered and compared. Students were set to work on specific investigations rather than simply listening to lectures on established truths. The school was organized around a conviction that still strikes the careful observer as unusual, even now. The conviction that philosophy and empirical inquiry were not separate activities, but a single activity pursued at different levels of generality. That the philosopher who could not describe the parts of a cuttlefish and explain why they were arranged as they were had not fully understood what philosophy was for. Aristotle, pausing beside a marine specimen in the early morning light of the Lyceum, turning it slowly in his hands before setting it down to be described. This is not a scene from the margins of philosophy. This is what philosophy looked like when it was organized around the conviction that the world available to the senses was not a shadow of reality, but its most immediate and available form. The specimen is real. The observation is real. The question of what it means for this organism to be alive and to function as it does is a philosophical question of the first order, not a preliminary to philosophy, but its substance. The school he built gathered around it the patient accumulation of knowledge across every domain of living things, logic as the instrument of clear thinking, natural philosophy as the account of the physical world in its broadest dimensions, biology as the close investigation of the organisms that populated it, psychology as the account of what it meant for those organisms to be alive in the fullest sense, ethics and politics as the investigation of how the human animal could live well in community with others of its kind. None of these was incidental. Each was part of a single sustained attempt to understand what it meant for things to be the things they were. The ground has been laid slowly and with care, the way ground must be laid when what is to be built upon it is intended to stand. Something is about to be carefully and unhurriedly unfolded, the question of the soul, which is also the question of what it means to be alive, not as an emergency or a mystery demanding immediate solution, but as the kind of question a careful person can sit with through a long and patient night, the kind of question that rewards the same quality of attention that a physician gives to a body, the same quality of attention that a philosopher gives to a world he has decided, against his teacher's example, to take entirely seriously. In the second book of De Anima, Aristotle pauses before beginning his own account to acknowledge something that most philosophers of his era would have preferred to skip past. The inquiry into the soul, he writes, is among the most difficult of all investigations, not the most rewarding, not the most important, though he believes it to be that too. Difficult first before anything else. The acknowledgement sits there at the opening of the argument, like a hand placed gently on the reader's arm, a gesture of honesty from someone who has already spent years with this material and has not found it easy. There is something in that admission, the willingness to begin with difficulty rather than promise, that suggests how seriously Aristotle intends to proceed. He had, by the time he wrote those lines, spent more than 20 years at Plato's academy. He had heard every version of the soul that his predecessors could offer, the soul as harmony, as number, as breath, as fire, as the thing that moves itself, as the immaterial pilot of a material vessel. He had taken each of these seriously and found each of them, in the end, unable to answer the question he considered most basic, not what the soul is made of or where it goes, but what the soul does, what the soul is for, and from that question, considered slowly and without hurry, his own account began to take its shape. The scene, imagined simply, is an early morning at the Lyceum, light entering through open walls. A work table on which something small has been laid out, a creature from the Aegean perhaps, brought in the day before by a student, and now waiting to be examined. Aristotle stands beside it, not yet writing, not yet speaking, simply looking. And the question that eventually forms itself, not hurried, not announced, is not a question about matter. It is a question about what this thing, while it was living, was doing that it is no longer doing now. The matter is mostly the same. The arrangement of it is not. Something has ceased. What that something was, its nature, its structure, its relationship to the body in which it resided. This is the problem Aristotle means to address, and he means to address it without retreating into language that makes the soul sound like a separate and secret entity hiding somewhere inside the flesh. He begins, as he often does, with a framework that applies not only to living things, but to everything in the natural world. Every substance, every naturally existing thing, is composed of two aspects that can be distinguished in thought, even though they are never found apart in reality. There is the matter, the stuff of which the thing is made, considered simply as the kind of stuff it is. And there is the form, the organization, the structure, the defining characteristic that makes that stuff into this particular kind of thing, rather than any other. The Greek terms are hyl for matter and morphe for form, and the view that natural things are always matter-form composites is what later philosophers would come to call hylomorphism, though Aristotle himself simply thought of it as describing what natural things are actually like. What matters for the soul, and what makes this framework philosophically useful rather than merely terminological, is what Aristotle means by form. He does not mean shape in the simple geometric sense, though shape can be one instance of form. He means the full set of capacities, the structural organization, the functional integrity that makes a thing the kind of thing it is. The form of an oak tree is not the outline visible from a distance. It is the whole set of living activities, the drawing up of water, the conversion of light, the production of acorns, the seasonal shedding and regrowth, that constitute what it is to be an oak rather than a pile of organic material in the approximate shape of a tree. Form, in this sense, is active. It is not a template imposed on matter from outside, but the way the matter of a particular kind of thing organizes and expresses itself when everything is as it should be. The soul in Aristotle's account is the form of a particular kind of natural substance, the kind capable of life. That sentence can be read quickly, and in being read quickly, it can seem like a small and technical claim, but held for a moment, turned over slowly, it changes the shape of the question. The soul is not inside the body. It is not a separate substance housed in biological matter, the way a driver sits inside a vehicle. It is the form of the body, which is to say, it is the organized activity, the functional integrity, the principle of living operation that distinguishes a living body from the same matter no longer alive. When Aristotle writes his definition, the soul is the first actuality of a natural body that has the potential for life. He is not offering a poetic metaphor. He is offering what he takes to be a precise and literal description of what the soul actually is. The phrase first actuality is doing important work in that definition, and Aristotle is careful about it. He distinguishes between two kinds of actuality, or two ways in which a capacity can be realized. A person who knows how to speak a language has that knowledge as a permanent possession, a stable capacity that belongs to them, whether or not they are currently speaking. This is first actuality, a form of organization, a readiness that is genuinely present and genuinely real, even when it is not being actively exercised. Second actuality is the exercise itself, the speaking that actualizes the knowledge in real time, making audible what was previously only a capacity. Aristotle wants to say that the soul is the first actuality of the living body, the organized readiness for life, not the second actuality, which would be the ongoing exercise of every living function simultaneously. Consider a person in deep and dreamless sleep. The body continues its work, the heart moves, the lungs fill and empty, cells rebuild themselves in the silence of a resting organism. But perception is suspended, movement is suspended, thought, insofar as it requires wakefulness, is suspended. None of the capacities the soul makes possible are being visibly exercised, and yet the soul is entirely present. It has not departed during the hours of sleep, waiting somewhere at a distance to return at waking. The soul is the first actuality, the organized, form-possessing, capacity-holding structure of the body, and that structure persists through sleep as fully as it persists through any waking hour. The capacities are real, even when they are not in use. The form is present, even when none of its characteristic activities are being expressed. To be a living body is already to have the soul, in the way that the person asleep already knows the language they will speak when they wake. That image, the sleeping person, the body breathing in the dark, all its capacities held in quiet reserve, is not incidental to the philosophy. It is the philosophy made visible, because what Aristotle is resisting with considerable care and considerable force is any account of the soul that treats it as separable from the body, in the way a tenant is separable from a house, or a pilot separable from a ship. Both analogies had been used by predecessors, and Aristotle uses the second of them himself at one point, though with an important qualification. If the soul were simply a pilot using the body as its instrument, the soul could in principle be removed from the body and remain what it is. A pilot without a ship is still a pilot, temporarily displaced, perhaps, but essentially unchanged. Aristotle does not think the soul can be understood this way. He thinks the relationship is deeper than that, and the depth of it is what the hylomorphic framework is designed to express. Two analogies recur in Aristotle's account, and both of them reward slow attention. The first involves a wax seal and the impression it makes. When a signet ring is pressed into warm wax and then lifted away, the wax retains the shape, the form of the seal. The seal and the wax are two different things, clearly enough, but the shape, the impression left behind, belongs to neither of them separately. It is not in the seal, which has moved on. It is not a property of the wax considered simply as wax, since the same wax before the pressing held no such form. The form exists in and through the wax, having been organized in this particular way. And now here is the crucial question Aristotle presses. Would it make sense to ask whether the shape and the wax are two different things? In one sense, the question is obvious. Of course, the gold of the ring is not the wax, and of course, the ring itself is not the impression. But the impression and the shaped wax, those are not two things. They are one thing described in two different registers, once by its matter, once by its form. And asking whether the soul and the body are two separate things, in Aristotle's view, makes exactly this confusion. The soul is the form of the body. The ensouled body is not two things that have been combined. It is one thing described from two angles. The second analogy is simpler and more concentrated. Aristotle asks the reader to imagine an eye considered in isolation, severed from any living creature. The eye, examined anatomically, contains all the physical structures that constitute an eye: the lens, the fluid, the layers of tissue. But is it an eye? Aristotle's answer is that it is an eye in name only. A painted eye would be an eye in the same sense, in the sense of resembling one, of having the word applicable to it in a loose and qualified way. What makes a real eye? A real eye is not its physical composition, but its capacity to see. Sight is the soul of the eye, in Aristotle's formulation. And if sight is absent, if the thing before us has all the material features of an eye, but can perform no act of seeing, then whatever it is no longer, in any meaningful sense, an eye. Now extend that thought to the living body as a whole. The soul is to the body what sight is to the eye, not something inside it, not a passenger carried within it, but the functional capacity that the body properly organized simply is. Without the soul, the body is not a body with something missing. It is, in the relevant sense, no longer a body at all, for the same reason that a stone carved to look like an eye is not a failed eye, but something else entirely. Aristotle had encountered, in the philosophies that preceded his own, a variety of views that treated the soul as something capable of moving freely between different kinds of bodies. Some of these views were associated with Pythagorean traditions, others with the broader current of thought that held the soul to be naturally immortal and only contingently housed in this or that particular body. On these views, the same soul might animate a human being in one lifetime and an animal in the next, the soul persisting through successive bodily habitations, the way a traveler moves through successive inns. Aristotle found this picture, however dignified its intentions, philosophically incoherent, not because he dismissed the question of what happens to the soul at death. He was too careful a thinker to dismiss any serious question, but because the picture of free transmigration failed to account for something he considered undeniable. That specific forms of soul belong necessarily to specific kinds of bodies. A carpenter's skills belong to a carpenter and cannot simply be transferred to a block of wood. The form of a house is realized in certain kinds of material and not in others. You cannot build a house whose form is expressed in water or in shadow. In the same way, the soul of a human being is the form of a human body, specifically organized in the particular way that human bodies are organized, capable of the particular range of activities that this kind of body makes possible. The idea that a human soul might equally well animate a dolphin or an oak tree treats form as something that floats free of matter, capable of inhabiting whatever substrate happens to be available. For Aristotle, this is precisely wrong. Form and matter are co-constitutive. Each particular form belongs to and is realized through a particular kind of matter. The soul is not a universal substance that happens to be located in this body. It is the form of this kind of living body, and that belonging is not incidental, but essential. There is something quietly settling in this account, once its implications have had time to arrange themselves. The soul, on Aristotle's view, is not waiting elsewhere. It is not a more real version of the person stored in some higher register of existence, temporarily reduced to the inconvenience of embodiment. It is here, in the shape of this particular body, in the organization that makes it alive, in the capacity for all the activities that constitute a living human existence. The body is not a cage. It is not an impediment. It is not a lesser medium through which the soul reluctantly operates. It is the very substance in and through which the soul exists, the matter whose form is the soul, the organization of which the soul is the name. Aristotle was not unaware that this account raised immediate and uncomfortable questions about what happens when that organization ceases. He did not resolve them neatly, and the record suggests he did not intend to. Some parts of his psychology point toward a soul entirely inseparable from and mortal with the body. Other passages, particularly those dealing with the highest capacities of rational thought, open a narrower door toward something that may not entirely follow the same logic. Those questions are genuinely open, and Aristotle left them open, which may be its own kind of honesty. But the central account, the definition at the core of De Anima, does not waver. The soul is the form of the living body. That is where the argument begins, and it is where it keeps returning. The image of the wax and the seal is worth dwelling in for a little longer because it holds something the argument alone does not quite capture. When the wax has been shaped by the seal, the shape is present in it in a way that is both completely real and completely invisible to anyone who does not know what to look for. The wax looks like wax. It has weight and warmth and the slight give of its material, but it carries, in its particular organization, the form of the seal that made it. The form is not visible as something separate from the wax. It is visible only as the wax organized in this way, rather than that way. And what makes it an impression, rather than an arbitrary lump of wax, is that the organization is not accidental. It is the result of a real contact between the seal and the wax, a real event in the world that left a real trace, one that persists even after the seal has moved on. The soul, for Aristotle, is something like that trace, not a trace left by something that has departed, but the living form of an organization that is still present, still active, still constituting what this thing is. When the form is fully realized, when the living body is in the full exercise of all its capacities, the soul is not more present than it was during sleep. The presence is constant. What varies is the expression of it, the degree to which the first actuality is being converted into second actuality, the degree to which the capacity is being used. The soul at rest is still entirely the soul. The living body in sleep is still entirely alive. The form remains, patient and intact, in the matter that has received it. There is a lyre that appears sometimes in the edges of these discussions, not in Aristotle's text specifically, but in the vicinity of it, in the way the problem shapes itself when you follow it carefully. The lyre lies unplayed in a room. Its strings are tuned to a particular set of relationships. The wood of its body has been shaped and fitted to carry the resonance that those string relationships will produce. Everything necessary for music is present in it, and the question that forms slowly is this: is the music inside the lyre waiting, or is the music the lyre itself when the lyre is properly used? Aristotle would likely say that the capacity for music is the form of this particular instrument, the organization of string and wood and hollow space that makes this thing a lyre rather than a piece of shaped wood. The capacity is real even in silence. The music is the full actualization of what is already, in a different mode, present, and the soul, on this way of seeing it, is not something the body contains. It is what the body is when the body is alive. There is a plant, too. Always somewhere in Aristotle's thinking there is a plant, because plants represent for him the minimum case, the simplest possible instance of what having a soul looks like. A vine in the garden of the Lyceum, extending itself toward light, not pulled by light from outside, and not pushed by anything mechanical from below, but unfolding according to an inner principle that is neither visible from the outside nor separable from the growing itself. The growing is the expression of the form. The form is what makes the growing intelligible as the activity of this kind of thing, rather than merely the movement of biological matter. The soul of the vine is present in every millimeter of extension, in every root finding water, in every leaf orienting itself. The vine does not know what it is doing, in any sense that involves awareness or intention, but what it is doing has a structure, a directedness, a goal orientation, however rudimentary, that distinguishes it from the movement of a stone falling toward the earth. Aristotle found that distinction important enough to build the whole of his psychology on it. Not because the vine is conscious, or because the vine has purposes in any robust sense, but because even at this minimal level, the living thing displays something that dead matter does not display, an organization that is aimed at the continuation of the kind of thing the organism is. The vine tends toward its own maintenance and reproduction. That tendency, that internal directedness, is not something added to the vine from outside. It is what the vine is. And if that is granted, if the soul is understood as this kind of internal organizing principle, the form whose presence distinguishes a living thing from the matter it is made of, then the soul is neither mysterious nor hidden. It is in a sense the most obvious thing in the world. It is visible everywhere that anything is alive. In the middle years of the Lyceum, when Aristotle was writing and revising the text that would eventually be gathered under the title De Anima, the intellectual landscape around him was still largely organized by Platonic assumptions. The soul was, for most educated people of his era, a thing more real than the body, more enduring, more essentially oneself, temporarily housed in flesh and bone, and destined to outlast the housing. To tell such people that the soul was the form of the body, not more real than the body, not independent of the body, not capable of existing or being understood apart from the body, was to say something they were not prepared to hear easily. Aristotle knew this. He spent considerable effort showing why the alternative views, however intuitive they might feel, could not survive careful examination. He was not trying to diminish the soul. He was trying to understand it more precisely than it had been understood before. The comparison between the soul's relationship to the body and the relationship between the shape of a wax impression and the wax that holds it. That comparison is doing exactly this work. It is not diminishing the shape by identifying it with the wax. The shape is real. The shape is what makes this piece of wax the thing it is, a seal impression bearing the form of a particular design, capable of authenticating documents and identifying its owner. To say that the shape and the wax are not two separate things is not to say the shape does not matter. It is to say that the shape matters in and through the wax that holds it, and nowhere else, and that this is not a limitation on the shape, but simply the truth about where form exists. Form always exists in matter. The soul always exists in a living body. And asking whether the soul could exist elsewhere, asking whether the soul could survive the dissolution of the body, is from within this framework like asking whether a shape could persist after the matter that holds it has been completely destroyed. The question can be asked. Whether it has an answer is a different matter entirely. What Aristotle gave the history of philosophy in this account is not primarily a theory about death or immortality. What he gave is a way of understanding the living as living, a way of seeing the organized, active, striving, perceiving, thinking body, not as a soul that has been unfortunate enough to be temporarily embodied, but as a single, unified thing whose two aspects are inseparable and co-constitutive. The form and the matter are not two things. The soul and the body are not two things. They are one thing. This body, this organization, This particular instance of form realized in matter, considered from two different angles, the way the concavity and convexity of a curved line are not two different lines, but the same line seen from inside and outside. In the long quiet of a room at the end of the day, when the body has settled and the ordinary business of perception is beginning to soften at its edges, what remains is the first actuality, the organized form of the living body, holding its capacities in reserve, neither fully exercising them nor having set them aside. The breathing continues. The warmth of the body persists. The form is present in the matter, as it always is, as it will continue to be through the hours ahead. Nothing has gone elsewhere. Nothing is waiting somewhere else to return. The soul, if Aristotle is right, and the question of whether he is right, has occupied serious thinkers for more than 2,000 years without being closed, is the form of this life, here organized in this way, resting in its first actuality, holding all of what it is quietly in reserve. Separating the soul from the body, in this account, is not something that could be done carefully or gradually or with sufficient philosophical ingenuity. It would be like separating a shape from the matter that holds it, not difficult but impossible, not because of any limitation in our technique, but because there is no shape apart from matter to be separated. What the shape is the shaped matter. What the soul is the living body, not elsewhere, not behind or beneath or above the body, not departing when the eyes close, not absent when the mind has gone quiet and the hours of sleep have begun to do their patient work. Here, as the form of this life, and nowhere else, and not divided from the breathing and the stillness of the night. The soul present, as it always is, as the very shape of what continues. Somewhere along the coast of Asia Minor, in the years when Aristotle had left Athens behind and was traveling through the islands and inlets of the Aegean, he spent time watching things grow, not dramatically, not with any event worth marking on a calendar. A vine extended itself day by day toward a source of light it could not see. A root pushed against stone it could not feel in any way a stone can be said to feel. A seed rested in dry soil through a long season, holding everything it would eventually become in a form so compressed and quiet that nothing from the outside could distinguish it from an ordinary piece of matter. And then the rain came, and it began. Aristotle watched this. He watched it with the same patience he brought to the dissection of a cuttlefish or the examination of a developing embryo in the shell. He was not watching for drama. He was watching because he believed that the most fundamental questions about what it means to be alive were answered, if they were answered anywhere, in these slow and unpromising events. The vine did not know it was extending toward light. The seed did not intend to germinate. Nothing was choosing, and yet something was happening that was unmistakably different from what happened when a stone was placed in the same soil, or a piece of metal left in the same rain. Something in the living thing was organizing itself. Something was at work in it that was not at work in the merely material. What that something was, how to name it, how to think about it clearly, without either inflating it into mystery or reducing it to mechanism. This was the question Aristotle had been turning over for years by the time he sat down to write what would become the De Anima. The soul, he had decided, was real, but it was not what most people, then or since, had imagined it to be. And before he could say what it was, he needed to say what its most basic form looked like. The form that appeared first in the order of life, the form that everything alive shared before it shared anything else. He needed to start with the vine. He called it the threpticon, the nutritive soul. The name is less important than what it names, and what it names is almost too simple to hold philosophical weight, which is perhaps why it has often been overlooked in favor of the more dramatic faculties above it. The nutritive soul is the capacity for taking in nourishment, for growing, and for reproducing. That is all. That is everything. For a plant, it is the entirety of what can be said about the soul at all. There is no perception, no desire, no deliberation, only this persistent and patient work of continuing, taking in what the environment offers, growing toward a form that is already, in some compressed way, present in what the thing is, producing in time another instance of that form. It sounds minimal. It sounds like a description of chemistry, but Aristotle was insistent that it was not chemistry, or rather, that it was not only chemistry, that calling it chemistry and stopping there was precisely the kind of reductive move that missed the whole point of the inquiry. The nutritive soul was not merely a set of material processes taking place in biological tissue. It was the organizing principle that made those processes run in the direction they ran, that kept the vine extending toward light rather than collapsing inward, that ensured the seed became this kind of plant and not another, that oriented all the chemical activity of a living body toward the maintenance and continuation of a particular form. The matter was doing something that matter, left entirely to its own principles, would not be expected to do. Something was shaping it from within. A fig tree in winter soil is drawing water upward through structures so fine and intricate that their existence was not fully understood until centuries after Aristotle. It is converting light into substance at a rate and with a precision that no human engineer has fully replicated. It is maintaining the chemical balance of its cells against the constant pressure of an environment that would, if the organizing activity stopped, immediately begin to dissolve it back into simpler things. None of this is visible from the outside. None of it announces itself. The tree simply stands there, looking inert, in the gray light of an early morning, and the nutritive soul goes quietly about its work, keeping the form alive, holding the matter to its shape, turning the world's raw material into more tree. This is where Aristotle begins the account of the soul's capacities, not with thought, not with perception, not with the dramatic interior life of a conscious creature moving through a world it can recognize and respond to. He begins here with the fig tree because he believes the foundation matters, and that no account of the higher faculties will stand unless it is built on an honest recognition of what they are built on. The rational soul, when it arrives, will not replace the nutritive. It will include it. The human being thinks, but the human being also eats, grows, sleeps, and continues. And the same organizing principle that keeps the vine alive is at work, quietly and without ceasing, in every human body that has ever done any thinking at all. The nutritive soul, then, is universal among living things. Everything that is alive has it. The oak in the kelp, and the lichen on the north face of a stone, and the bacterium in the deep cold water of an ocean trench, all of them are exercising, in one form or another, the capacity Aristotle names. It is the floor of the house, everything else is built above it. And Aristotle is careful to note that it is not merely present in higher organisms as a relic or a remnant. It is not something that plants have and animals happen also to carry as a kind of leftover inheritance. It is active and indispensable in everything alive. The animal that stops feeding, stops growing, stops maintaining its form against the pressure of dissolution, that animal is dying, regardless of how much it may still perceive and desire and reason. The nutritive soul is not the least important capacity, simply because it is the most basic. It is the condition without which none of the rest is possible. There is something restful about this recognition, once it is held quietly enough. Before any question arises about what a living thing can think or feel or want, there is already this, the simple, patient, ongoing work of continuing to be alive. In every moment of waking and sleeping, in every moment of thought, or stillness, or deep dreamless rest, the nutritive soul is doing what it does, without assistance or awareness, or any deliberate effort from the organism it inhabits. A person lying still in the dark, their breathing slow, and their thoughts dissolved into something that does not yet have a name, is nevertheless entirely and continuously alive. The nutritive soul keeping the form of that life organized and present, turning the night's quiet hours into more of the same continuing person, without pause, without interruption, without any requirement that the person in question do anything at all. The second capacity, which Aristotle calls the aestheticon, arrives at the border between plant and animal. It is the capacity for sense perception, and its arrival in the order of living things marks a change so significant that Aristotle treats it as the defining characteristic of a wholly different form of life, not a variation within the same category as plant life, but a genuinely new kind of thing in the world, as thing that can be touched by the world and know it has been touched. Touch is first. Aristotle is specific about this, and his specificity is deliberate. Among all the senses, touch is the one that no animal can lack and still remain an animal. An organism without sight can be a genuine animal. There are many such organisms, living at the bottom of deep water or in the dark of soil, registering nothing visual, moving through a world that is for them entirely tactile and chemical. An organism without hearing can be an animal, but an organism without any capacity for touch at all, without any sensitivity to the boundary between its body and the world, could not survive, could not navigate, could not distinguish food from obstacle, warm from cold, the harmless from the damaging. Touch is the most primitive and the most necessary of the sensitive capacities, the sense closest to the nutritive level of life, and it is where the sensitive soul begins. From touch, the hierarchy extends. More complex animals have more senses. They can distinguish not just that something is present, but what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it smells like at a distance, before contact is made. The sensitive soul, in its fuller expressions, builds an increasingly rich picture of the world, a world that was, for the plant, entirely without qualities beyond the chemical gradient of soil and the direction of light, but becomes, for the sensing animal, a world of textures and shapes and movements and distances, a world that has an outside and an inside, and a world the animal is genuinely in, rather than merely continuous with. An octopus moves through shallow water at dusk, its skin shifting through colors that have no names in human language, for the speed at which they change. It has detected something through a combination of chemical sensitivity and the displacement of water by a distant movement, something that might be food or might be danger, the perception not yet resolved into action. The skin changes again, the arms slow. This is the sensitive soul in operation, a real event, a genuine contact between the form of the living thing and the form of the world, the animal becoming momentarily, in its sensing, more like the thing it has sensed, not merged with it, not confused with it, simply responsive to it, in the specific way that sensing is a form of responsiveness, the world's form arriving in the animal's body without the world's matter following it in. And where sensing is, appetite is also. Aristotle holds this as a close connection. The sensitive soul is never purely cognitive, never merely a registration of what is present in the environment without any response to it. Perception is always accompanied by pleasure and pain, and from pleasure and pain, appetite arises. The soul's fundamental orientation toward and away from things, the driving force that connects what is known to what is done. An animal that perceives warmth and finds it pleasant will move toward warmth. An animal that perceives pain will move away from the source of pain. The sensitive soul is not a spectator of the world, but a participant in it, shaped by what it finds, pushed and pulled by the qualities it encounters. This is what distinguishes the animal so completely from the plant, even though both have the nutritive soul in common, even though the same basic work of feeding and growing and continuing is happening in both. The plant is continuous with its environment in a way the animal is not. It takes what comes to it, what falls on it, what the soil offers, and it processes what it receives without registering it as anything. The animal is in its environment differently. It encounters things. It responds to things. The world for the sensing creature is not just a medium, but a landscape, something that has features, offers possibilities, presents threats, contains what is needed and what is to be avoided. And all of this is organized by the sensitive soul's capacity to receive the world's forms and be moved by what it receives. There is a moment in the day, usually late, when the light has changed and the body has been through whatever the day required of it. When a person lies down and becomes for a few minutes almost purely sensitive, the thinking slows, the concerns of the day lose their grip. What remains is the body's awareness of its own warmth, the weight of a blanket, the particular quality of darkness behind the eyes, the sound of rain on a window, or wind in branches somewhere outside. All the rich machinery of human thought is still present, but it is idling rather than working, and what rises to fill the space it has vacated is the simple, unmediated contact of a sensing body with the world around it. The warmth is just warm, the sound is just sound. The sensitive soul, which does its work in the background of every waking hour, is suddenly, briefly, in the foreground, doing what it was always doing, noticed now only because the more elaborate activities have quieted enough to let it be felt. Aristotle would not have been surprised by this. He believed the sensitive soul was older than thought, deeper in the architecture of the living thing, more fundamental in the order of what a body needs in order to be alive. A creature that could only think and could not sense would, in his framework, be an impossible abstraction. Thought requires content, and all content begins in perception. The sensitive soul does not serve the rational soul in the way a servant serves a master. It is the ground the rational soul stands on, the source of the material that thought will eventually shape into understanding. And so the rational soul, the logikon, the noetikon, the capacity for thought and deliberation, and the governance of action by reason, arrives not as a replacement for what came before, but as a third layer laid over two that remain fully in place beneath it. The human being, in Aristotle's account, is not primarily a rational creature who also happens to have a body that requires feeding and a nervous system that picks up sensory signals. The human being is a living thing first, an animal second, and a rational animal third, each layer requiring the ones below it, none of them dissolving when the one above arrives. What does it mean to have a rational soul in Aristotle's sense? It means, first of all, the capacity to grasp universal principles, not just to perceive that this fire is hot, but to understand what heat is, not just to feel the pull of a particular desire, but to deliberate about whether acting on it is good. It means the capacity to step back from the immediate pressure of appetite and sensation and ask, given what I know, given what I value, given who I am and what I am trying to become, what should be done here? It means the capacity for self-governance, for the alignment of action with a considered understanding of what is genuinely worthwhile, for the kind of life that is not simply lived, but in some meaningful sense chosen. But Aristotle is careful here. About a temptation that runs through the whole of the philosophical tradition before him, the temptation to treat the rational capacity as if it were the whole of the human being, as if the presence of reason in a creature meant that the creature was, at bottom, nothing but a reason-bearing thing. The body and its appetites are regrettable accompaniment to an essentially intellectual nature. This was Plato's tendency. It was the tendency of the Pythagorean tradition before him. It was, in various forms, the dominant cultural assumption of the philosophical world into which Aristotle had been educated, and it was, in Aristotle's considered view, simply wrong. The human being who reasons is also the human being who is hungry, who feels cold, who is moved by what is beautiful, who feels the pull of rest when the body has been working for a long time. The rational soul does not descend into a body it finds alien. It arises from a body it belongs to. The thinking and the feeding and the sensing are not three separate activities carried out by three loosely confederated entities sharing a common address. They are three capacities of a single living thing, nested within one another, in the way that the geometry of a tree is nested within its growth and the growth within its chemistry. Different levels of description of the same continuous, integrated, entirely unified phenomena. The hierarchy is real, but it is not a hierarchy of value in the sense of lesser things to be left behind, as the more important ones are reached. The nutritive soul is not a primitive remnant that a rational being is fortunate to have mostly transcended. It is the foundation of everything the rational being can do, the ongoing work without which the rational capacity would have nothing to operate in or through. The sensitive soul is not a distraction from thought. It is the source of everything thought works with, all the material of perception and memory and imagination that rational deliberation organizes into understanding. The rational soul does not make the other capacities obsolete. It makes them, in a human being, part of a life that is capable of something the plant and the simple animal are not capable of, the considered, self-aware, deliberately shaped kind of existence that Aristotle called eudaimonia, and that he believed was possible only when all three layers of the soul were functioning well and in proper relation to one another. There is a kind of tree. Aristotle may have walked past one in the garden of the Lyceum on a given morning, pausing to look at the new growth at the tip of a branch that produces the same pattern of leaves year after year in a sequence determined entirely by the form of the tree itself, not by any thought, not by any choice. The leaf grows outward from the stem in a precise and consistent angle, and then another at the same angle, and then another, and the pattern that results from a whole season of this silent and mechanical seeming activity is recognizably the pattern of that tree, the nutritive soul expressing, through matter and over time, the form that the tree. This is as much soul as a tree has, and it is, in its way, entire. The tree lacks nothing that a tree requires. The form of the tree is fully present in the growing. The octopus in the shallow water, shifting its color and slowing its arms, and waiting to determine whether the disturbance in the water is food or danger. It has more. It has the nutritive soul and the sensitive soul together, and in their combination, it has something neither alone could produce. A creature that is not just continuous with its environment, but genuinely in relation to it, able to receive the world's features and respond to them, moved by what it finds, capable of something that resembles, in its most basic form, experience. The octopus is not merely alive, it is alive, and in some minimal but real sense aware. And then there is the person lying in the dark at the end of a long day, aware of hunger and warmth and the sound of rain all at once, feeling the pleasant weight of the body's tiredness, thoughts beginning to soften and loosen their grip on the specific and the demanding, all three layers present simultaneously, all three doing their work, each one required by the next, the whole of them together constituting what it is to be this particular kind of living thing. The nutritive soul is keeping the body's form organized, turning the hours of sleep into more of the same continuing person. The sensitive soul is registering in a quieter and quieter way the warmth and the sound and the gentle pressure of the dark. The rational soul is not gone. It is not switched off as if by a mechanical lever when consciousness begins to ease, but it is releasing its grip on the deliberate and the purposive, letting the mind settle back through the layers it was built on, through the imagery and the memory that belong to the sensing animal beneath the thinking one, and then further still, toward the deep unwitnessed work of the body's own continuing. Aristotle notes, in a passage in his biological writings, that certain creatures occupy a border territory between the capacities. Organisms in the ocean that contract when touched and extend when still, that seem to respond to the world in some minimal way, but lack the complex sensory apparatus of what anyone would confidently call an animal, that seem to have something more than the purely nutritive soul, but less than what is clearly sensitive. He does not force a classification. He notes the difficulty. He holds the question open and moves on, because he is more interested in understanding the phenomenon clearly than in fitting it to a neat taxonomy. This is the empiricist instinct, the preference for honest observation over tidy system, the willingness to let the natural world be more complex than the framework built to describe it. The border cases are important. They are important not because they undermine the framework, but because they show that the framework is describing something real, a genuine gradient in the living world, a genuine difference in the capacities that living things possess, a genuine hierarchy that is not simply invented by the philosopher and imposed on nature from outside, but found in nature and traced with care. The plant is fully alive and fully without sensation. The complex animal is fully alive and fully sentient. The human being is fully alive and fully sentient and fully rational. The border organisms suggest that these capacities do not appear suddenly, in sharp discontinuous leaps, but emerge gradually, the higher forms of life arising from lower ones, through a continuous process of increasing complexity and integration. The hierarchy is nested, not ranked. That is the distinction Aristotle wants most carefully to hold. Nested means each higher level includes the lower ones entirely. The rational animal has the nutritive and sensitive souls, not as lesser parts of itself, but as the very ground it stands on. Ranked would mean the higher is better in a way that diminishes the lower, that the plant is a failed animal and the animal a failed human being, that the whole scale is oriented toward the rational as its goal, and everything else is a mere approximation of what it is trying to be. Aristotle does not hold this view. The plant is fully what it is. The animal is fully what it is. Each form of life possesses the capacities appropriate to what it is. It is not measured against what it lacks, but understood in terms of what it has, in terms of how its particular form organizes its particular matter toward the continuation of its particular life. There is something in this picture of the living world, stratified but not hierarchical in the diminishing sense, organized but not teleologically aimed at any single summit, that carries a specific quality of equanimity. It is the equanimity of someone who has looked at many kinds of living things and found each of them interesting on its own terms, each of them a complete expression of a particular form of life, none of them failing to be something it was supposed to be. The nutritive soul, at the base of the hierarchy, is not a disappointment. It is the most universal fact about the living world, the thing everything that is alive shares, the common ground of all the variation and complexity that the hierarchy builds upon it. A person breathing slowly in the dark has this in common with the lichen on the stone, and the vine in the winter garden, and the anemone in the tide pool. The nutritive soul, doing its patient and unceasing work. The lichen does not know. It shares this with the person in the dark. The person in the dark rarely thinks about the lichen. But Aristotle has followed the thread down to its root and found it, the same organizing principle, the same fundamental capacity, the same quiet insistence on continuing, present in everything that is alive, the most ancient and the most universal soul, the first and deepest layer of what it means for anything at all to be here. The sensitive soul adds to this a world where the plant has an environment, a medium it is continuous with, draws from, extends into. The animal has something more, a setting, a context, a landscape that is encountered rather than simply inhabited, a world that has features because there is something there, to perceive those features as features. Hunger becomes appetite rather than merely a chemical deficit. Cold becomes something felt rather than merely a change in the thermal state of tissue. The world, once a sensing creature is in it, acquires a texture and a quality that it did not have for the plant, not because the world has changed, but because there is now something in the world capable of receiving its form, capable of being genuinely affected by what is there. And the rational soul adds to the sensitive soul the capacity to step back from that world, to look at it rather than simply being in it, to ask not just what is present, but what it means, not just what is desired, but whether it is worth desiring, not just what is happening, but whether it is good. This is the capacity that allows a human being to be, in some meaningful sense, the author of a life, rather than simply the subject of one, to bring deliberation and understanding and the long view of what constitutes a genuinely worthwhile existence to the relentless pressure of appetite and sensation and the moment's demands. But none of this, not the deliberation, not the understanding, not the long view, is possible without the layers beneath it. The body must be fed, the senses must be receiving, the appetite must be present and felt. The thinking takes place inside a living thing, not above it, not at a comfortable distance from the biological necessities that the living thing is constantly managing. The wisdom Aristotle is reaching for, the eudaimonia he takes to be the highest expression of what a human life can be, is not a wisdom achieved by escaping the body or transcending the animal. It is a wisdom achieved inside a body, through the body, in full acknowledgement of everything that the nutritive and sensitive souls make necessary and possible. There is a particular stillness that comes, sometimes, in the last few minutes before sleep properly arrives, a stillness in which the thinking has almost entirely released its grip, and what remains is a layered awareness that is not quite thought and not quite sensation, but something of both, the mind moving through images that arrive without any particular agenda, the body warm and still and maintaining itself through the night's coming hours. The whole thing, the person in the room, the breathing, the quiet warmth, entire and complete in what it is, not waiting for anything, not working toward anything, not failing to be something more, just alive, in the deep and layered way that Aristotle spent his life trying to understand, the nutritive soul, doing what it always does, the sensitive soul settling into its quieter nocturnal register, and the rational soul releasing, for a few hours, its careful governance, settling back through the layers it was built on, resting inside the form of a life that has, tonight, been fully enough. That fullness, the sense of a living thing, complete in what it is, all its capacities present, the highest resting in the foundation, the lowest provides, is what Aristotle found in the vine growing toward light, and the octopus shifting its color in the shallows, and the border creature in the tide pool contracting and extending without any clear classification. He found it in the living world because it was there to be found, and the finding of it, patient, empirical, unhurried, was itself a form of the rational soul, doing what the rational soul, at its best, does, looking at what is actually there, carefully, without any urgency to be elsewhere, and recognizing in what is found something complete and quiet and entirely real. A signet ring pressed into warm wax and then lifted away. The shape remains. The ring is gone, but what the ring was, the particular curve of its edges, the carved letters, the weight and logic of its design, all of that is still there, held quietly in the softened surface of the wax. Aristotle paused at this image long enough to make it the center of his thinking about how the soul receives the world, not the ring, not the wax, the form held in one without the matter of the other. Something passed between them, and the wax is changed by it, and the ring remains entirely what it was, and what passed between them is now resting in the wax like a thought in a mind at the end of a long and careful day. This is where Aristotle begins his account of how the living soul makes contact with the world outside itself. The senses, he writes in De Anima, are capable of receiving the sensible form of a thing without receiving the thing's matter. When an eye receives the shape and color of a leaf, the eye does not become green, does not become leaf-shaped, does not take in the cellulose and water and chlorophyll of the thing itself. What arrives is the form, the particular organization, the sensory signature, the visible character of the leaf as it presents itself to a creature capable of receiving it. The wax takes on the shape, not the gold. Aristotle was precise about this in the way that someone is precise when they believe the precision matters. The sense organ, he says, undergoes a genuine physical change in the act of perception. This is not metaphor. Something real happens in the eye when light strikes it. Something real happens in the ear when sound moves through it. Perception is not the soul reaching out toward the world from behind a wall. It is a real meeting, a real alteration, a genuine event in which the world and the soul make contact, and both are changed by the contact in their separate ways. The ring presses, the wax softens and receives, and between the pressing and the lifting, something new exists that was not there before. Aristotle held this view against those who thought the soul, perceived by sending something of itself outward toward the object, a theory he found confused and unnecessary. The object is present. The sense organ is capable of receiving it. The form arrives. That is the whole of what needs to be said, and the simplicity of it, once understood, has the quality of something that had been complicated far past what the complication warranted. There is something almost restful in this account. The world does not need to be conquered or reached or decoded. It arrives, it offers its forms, its colors and shapes and textures and sounds and temperatures to creatures capable of receiving them, and those creatures receive the forms without being consumed by them, without being turned into the things they perceive. A person who listens to rain is not made of rain. A person who holds a smooth stone in the dark is not made of stone. What passes between the thing and the perceiver is the form alone, quiet and precise, carrying the world's character into the body that receives it. The room where Aristotle worked in the Lyceum was not entirely silent, even at night. Athens was a living city, and the Lyceum sat at its edge near the river Eridanos, with the sounds of the city carrying through the air and the sounds of the natural world carrying from the other side. He would have heard both at once, in the undivided way that ordinary experience presents itself, not a sound from one side and then a sound from the other, but sound, temperature, light, the smell of the parchment he was writing on, all arriving together in a single and unbroken field of awareness. He noticed this, he thought about it, and he wrote, carefully, about how it was possible, because here is the problem that the wax and the ring do not fully solve. Each sense receives a particular kind of form. The eye receives color and shape, the ear receives sound, the nose receives smell, touch receives warmth and texture, but what is perceived is never only color, only sound, only texture. What is perceived is a world. What is perceived is an olive branch in the morning with its silvery color and its particular weight in the hand, and the dry rustling sound it makes in wind, and the faint bitterness of its smell, all of that arriving together, unified as a single thing in a single moment of experience. No individual sense does this. No individual sense can perceive across its own boundary into the deliverances of another, and yet the perceiver does not experience a chaos of unconnected impressions. The impressions are one. Aristotle named the faculty responsible for this unity. He called it the koine aesthesis, the common sense, though this is not the common sense of ordinary wisdom, not the down-to-earth good judgment that phrase usually carries in later speech. This is something more precise and more fundamental. The common sense for Aristotle is the seat of the soul's perceptual unity, the faculty that receives what all the individual senses deliver and holds it together in a single undivided field of awareness. It is where the color and the sound and the texture of the olive branch are brought together into one olive branch, one moment, one perception. The common sense does something else as well, something stranger and more difficult to name. It allows a perceiver to notice that they are perceiving, not just to see, but to notice that they are seeing, not just to hear, but to recognize the hearing as happening, to hold the seeing and the hearing together in the same awareness, and notice that both are present. This is the ground of temporal awareness, the thin, ongoing thread by which a perceiver holds together what was just experienced and what is being experienced now, making the world not a series of disconnected flashes, but a continuous presence. Without it, perception would be a series of instants, each complete and sealed and disconnected from the next. The common sense is what makes the series into a life. These are not simple mechanisms. Aristotle was not building a theory he found simple. What he was building was an account faithful, enough to the actual complexity of experience, to the weight and richness of what it is like to be a perceiving creature in a world full of perceivable things, that it did not lose the thing it was meant to explain before the explanation was finished. In the dark of a room at night, after the work of a day is over, and the city has quieted down to a low and distant murmur, the common sense continues its patient work. The warmth of the bed, and the sound of breathing, and the faint texture of fabric, and the dimness registered even through closed eyelids, all of it arrives together in a single and unified field of awareness, not separated out into its components, not presented as a list. The form of the room, the form of the moment, held in the perceiver, the way the impression of the ring is held in the wax, present, quiet, organized, and entirely real. Between this kind of perception and genuine rational thought, there is a middle space. Aristotle found it and gave it a name. He called it phantasia, which is usually translated as imagination, though the word carries something more specific than the English word suggests, something closer to the capacity for images, the ability to hold in the soul the appearance of something that is no longer immediately present to the senses. When the ring is lifted from the wax, the impression remains. When the olive branch is no longer in the hand, something of its presence lingers. Not the branch itself, not the sensation in real time, but what Aristotle called a phantasma, a mental image, an appearance, the residue of a perception that has passed. The phantasma is neither perception nor thought. It is between them. It is the form of a perceived thing held in the soul after the thing itself has departed, available to be worked with, recombined, considered, and eventually used by the rational part of the soul as the raw material for genuine thinking. Without imagination, Aristotle believed, rational thought would have nothing to work with. The intellect does not perceive the world directly. It works with images, with the soul's accumulated residue of genuine perceptual encounters with actual things, and from those images it draws out the general, the universal, the intelligible form that makes a kind of thing what it is, rather than merely what one particular instance of it happens to look like on a particular Tuesday afternoon. This is why the soul does not think in a vacuum. This is why genuine thought requires a life lived in actual contact with actual things, with seasons and faces, and the weight of tools, and the smell of places, and the sounds of languages spoken by people who meant what they said. Every abstraction has at its root a perception. Every universal was once, for someone, a particular. The form of the triangle that the mathematician considers was distilled, over a long development of human thought, from real triangles drawn in the sand and scratched into stone and traced with a finger on a flat surface. Aristotle's insistence on this is one of the places where his philosophy feels closest to the texture of actual experience, not because he was unwilling to think hard about abstractions, but because he had thought hard enough about them to know where they come from. Imagination, then, is not the faculty of unreality. It is not the place where the soul escapes from the world into private fantasy. It is the holding space, the place where the world's forms are kept after the world itself has moved on, where the evening sky is still present in some form after night has closed over it, where the voice of someone who has spoken is still present in some form in the silence that follows. Aristotle notes carefully that imagination is distinct from both perception and belief. Perceiving involves the actual presence of the object and a corresponding alteration in the sense organ. Believing involves judgment, truth and falsity, assent or dissent. Imagination is neither of these. It can arise in the absence of the object without requiring any judgment about what is real. A perceiver can hold an image before the mind and know it is an image, the way a person lying in the dark can hold the image of a face they have not seen in years, knowing it is held, knowing it is not perception, allowing it to be present without demanding it be more than it is. The moment before sleep is full of this, thoughts becoming less argumentative, less sequential, more imagistic, the mind releasing its grip on the logical thread and beginning to move through a looser and more floating space, where one image opens onto another without the transition needing to be explained or defended. A face, and then a doorway, and then the particular quality of light that falls on a stone wall at late afternoon, and then something that is not quite any of these things, but carries the mood of all of them together. Aristotle, Thinking about this from his position of careful observation and serious philosophy, would have recognized it. He did not think this was the soul becoming confused. He thought this was the soul relaxing its most demanding operations and settling into the layer just below them, the layer where imagination lives, where the forms of things are held without needing to be judged or organized or put to work. What lies above imagination, in Aristotle's account, is the hardest part. This is where the philosophy becomes most careful, most contested, and in a certain way, most open. The intellect, the capacity for genuine rational thought, does not perceive and does not imagine. It thinks. And what it thinks with are intelligible forms, not the sensory appearance of things, but the abstract structural characters that make things what they are, the universal patterns that particular things embody, and that the mind can grasp independently of any particular instance of them. The passive intellect is like a writing tablet before anything is written on it. This is Aristotle's image, offered with the carefulness of someone who knows that every image will eventually reach its limit. The tablet is not empty in a bad sense. It is not deficient. It is open, capable of receiving every form, capable of holding any impression, available to whatever genuine thinking may arrive. At rest, before any thought has occurred, the intellect is pure potential, capable of becoming whatever it is that it thinks, in the same way that the wax is capable of receiving whatever form the ring carries, without being anything in particular until the form arrives. The forms arrive in the intellect, the way sensible forms arrive in the sense organs, without the matter that carries them in the world. The intellect does not take in the physical bronze of a bronze sphere in order to think about the form of a sphere. It takes in the form alone, the intelligible structure, the mathematical organization that makes a sphere what it is, rather than anything else. And in thinking that form, the intellect and the form become, in Aristotle's strange and precise language, the same thing, not the same in every respect. Not the same as two identical objects are the same, but the same in the way that the wax impression and the ring are the same, the form held in a different matter, present in a new medium, real in a way that does not require the original object to be physically present. This is where the thinking gets very slow and very careful, because Aristotle, having worked through this account of how the intellect receives intelligible forms in the way the senses receive sensible forms, arrives at a difficulty. Sensible forms arrive from outside because the world is full of sensible things, radiating their sensory character outward for any equipped perceiver to receive. But intelligible forms, the abstract structures, the universals, the mathematical and logical forms that the intellect actually grasps when it thinks. Where do those come from? Who or what is doing? For the intellect, what the actual physical objects do for the senses. The answer Aristotle offers in the third book of De Anima is one of the most discussed and least resolved passages in the history of philosophy, and it is worth dwelling in it for a moment without trying to close it too quickly. The way one might dwell at the edge of a darkened room that opens somewhere interesting before deciding whether or not to enter. Aristotle distinguishes between two aspects of the intellect. One is the passive or potential intellect, the writing tablet, the open and receptive capacity for receiving intelligible forms. The other is something Aristotle calls an active intellect, and what he says about it is this: it is separable, unmixed, impassible, and in its essential nature, a kind of activity. It is, he says, like light in relation to color. Light does not create color. The colors of things exist potentially in the dark, waiting, available. What light does is make them actually visible, actually present to any eye equipped to receive them. The active intellect, in Aristotle's analogy, does something similar for intelligible forms. It makes them actually thinkable, actually available to the passive intellect, not by creating them, but by illuminating them, by bringing their potential into actuality. What this active intellect is, whether it is a part of each individual human soul, whether it is a separate principle operating on human minds from outside them, whether it is in some sense divine, whether it belongs to any particular person or to no one in particular, Aristotle does not say clearly, and this is not accidental vagueness. The passage reads as if he is thinking at the edge of what he can think, and he knows it, and he sets down what he can see, and leaves the rest in a condition of honest uncertainty. He says the active intellect alone, of all the soul's capacities, is immortal and eternal. He says that without it, nothing thinks, and then the passage ends, and what follows is commentary, centuries of it, in Arabic and Greek and Latin and Hebrew, and eventually in every language that has found the question worth returning to. Aristotle's student Theophrastus, who would later lead the Lyceum after Aristotle's death, reportedly spent years trying to understand what the active intellect was and could not fully satisfy himself. The Neoplatonist Alexander of Aphrodisias in the 2nd century identified it with the divine intellect that moves the cosmos. The great Islamic philosopher Ibn Rushd, who worked through De Anima with extraordinary care in 12th century Cordoba, argued that the active intellect was entirely separate from individual human souls, a single transpersonal principle that each human being participates in, but that belongs to none of them individually. Aquinas, reading the same passages in his cell in the 13th century, with the Latin translation open before him, disagreed, arguing that the active intellect must be a power of the individual soul if genuine individual knowledge is to be possible. The argument has not been settled. It is one of the places where the philosophy sits at the edge of itself and looks out over something it cannot fully see. What is possible to hold about this without forcing a resolution it has not earned is something like this. Aristotle was observing a real feature of thought. There is something in the activity of genuine thinking that feels different from the activity of perception, or memory, or imagination. Something that, when it is working well, seems to operate with a clarity and a kind of impersonal light that does not feel like the same order of thing as hunger, or warmth, or the recognition of a familiar face. Mathematicians sometimes describe it this way: the sense that when a proof is seen, it is not invented but discovered, that what is grasped is something that was always there, that did not come into being when the mathematician found it. Aristotle noticed this quality in thinking, and he tried to say what it meant. He concluded that whatever is responsible for the illumination of intelligible forms, whatever makes them actually available to thought, rather than merely potentially so, that thing has a character different from the rest of the soul, separable, unmixed, impassible, a kind of activity in its essential nature. Whether this amounts to a personal immortality, whether the active intellect that illuminates thought in one mind is the same principle that illuminates it in another, whether it belongs to the individual the way the nutritive soul belongs to the individual, these questions stand open in Aristotle's text, the way certain windows stand open in old stone buildings. The air moves through them freely, but the view from them is not entirely clear, and no amount of looking longer quite resolves what is there in the distance. The passive intellect, Aristotle says, does not survive. The capacity for thought, as it is bound up with the body, dependent on imagination and sensation, and the particular organization of a particular living creature that is finite. That belongs to the composite of form and matter that each living being is, and its end is the end that all such composites come to. What might continue, what might be, in some form separable and unmixed, is whatever was never quite enclosed in that composite to begin with. The active intellect, the illumination that makes thinking possible, whatever that is. This is held gently here, as Aristotle himself held it, not as a consolation, not as a doctrine of personal survival to be embraced or rejected, but as an honest observation at the edge of what the philosophy can see. The argument does not resolve into peace. It does not need to. It opens, and the opening is its nature, and there is something restful about a question that is clearly at the edge of what can be seen, rather than pretending to a clarity it does not have. The room where this thinking happens is dark now. The city outside is quieter than it was. The body that held the day's perceptions, all the sensible forms that arrived through the day, through the common sense that held them together in their unity, through the imagination that has been carrying them since, that body is beginning to release the work it was doing. The sense organs are still capable. The capacity for receiving sensible forms has not been removed, but the forms are fewer now, the stimulation lighter, the waking activity of the common sense, and the imagination softening towards something less organized and more drifting. Aristotle thought the sleeping body was not, in the full sense, unconscious. Sleep was, for him, a kind of preservation, the body's resources concentrated, the sense organs resting, the nutritive soul continuing its patient work of maintaining and repairing and sustaining the life that belongs to this particular body. The sensitive soul is not gone in sleep. Its organs are resting. The capacity remains, held in reserve, available to be woken by what is loud, or urgent, or significant enough to penetrate the rest. The sleeping body is what Aristotle called a first actuality, held in a state of temporary quiescence, the soul present as potential, fully there, fully the form of this living body, simply not performing in the moment. What persists through sleep in this account is not something apart from the body. It is the form of the body, the organizing principle of this particular living thing, its nutritive capacity still working below the threshold of awareness, its sensitive capacity ready but resting, its rational capacity quiet and not presently at work, but no less present for being quiet. The soul in sleep is not diminished. It is the same soul it was while waking, just as the lyre is the same lyre, whether it is being played or lying still in the dark. The music is not inside the instrument in the sense of being hidden within the wood and gut. The music is what happens when the instrument is properly used, by a person capable of playing it, in the presence of sound, and the instrument in silence is still the instrument, still the thing that music is the actuality of. The wax impression holds the shape of the ring through the night. The ring does not need to remain pressed into the wax for the form to remain. The form arrived, and it rests there, and the morning will find it unchanged, the curves and letters still clear, the shape still held in the softened surface, patient and exact. Nothing was lost in the interval. The active intellect, whatever it is, that separable, unmixed, impassible principle of illumination that Aristotle glimpsed and named and could not fully account for, does not rest the way the senses rest. Aristotle says it does not alternate between activity and inactivity in the way that the passive intellect does, receiving forms and releasing them, moving between thinking and not thinking. In its essential nature, it is activity, not a capacity that sometimes works and sometimes rests. Something more like the light itself, which does not turn on and off in response to whether something is there to be lit. That image, light that does not rest because it is not a resting kind of thing, was offered by Aristotle as an analogy, and he was careful not to take it further than it goes. Light, after all, can be blocked. Light is a physical thing subject to physical conditions. Whatever the active intellect is, Aristotle believed it was not subject to those conditions in the same way. He found himself unable to say more than this, and he set it down in the text and moved on, and the question has been in the room of philosophy ever since, present, waiting, luminous in the way that genuine questions are luminous, which is not the same as bright. In the hours before Aristotle died, he had traveled to Chalcis on the island of Euboea in the final year of his life, leaving Athens after political difficulties that made remaining there dangerous. He is said to have spent his last days in the house of his mother's family, near the sea. Whether he thought about his own philosophy at the end, whether he considered what his account of the soul implied for what was about to happen to the particular soul-body composite that had spent 62 years observing, arguing, writing, dissecting, and asking what it means to be alive, that cannot be known. He left no record of those last thoughts, if he had them. What he left was the text. The text has been held in many hands since then, copied onto papyrus in Athens, stored, lost, stored again, carried into Arabic in the 8th and 9th centuries through the work of translators who recognized that what they were holding was worth the labor of preservation. Read in Latin in the 12th century by scholars who found in it a framework so comprehensive and so careful that it reorganized the way the Christian philosophical tradition thought about the soul, about the body, about what makes a living thing alive. Read again and again by people who came to it, not sure what they were looking for, and found, somewhere in the argument about wax and rings and signet impressions and the light that makes colors visible, something they had needed to find. The signet ring leaves its impression in the wax and is lifted away. The form remains. The sense organ receives the sensible form of the world, and the world continues on its way. The phantasma drifts through the space between perception and thought, carrying the residue of what was seen and heard and felt through a day that is now settling into its ending. The passive intellect rests, open, available, the blank tablet waiting in the dark. And somewhere in the deepest and most uncertain part of the account, the part Aristotle himself could not fully illuminate, the active intellect continues in its essential nature, which is activity, which is the making visible of what is already there, which is something more like light than like a flame, present without requiring a performance of its presence. The room is quiet. The body holds its form. The soul is not elsewhere. It is here as it has always been, as the form of this breathing and continuing life, not departed, not waiting to depart, not hidden inside the body the way a pearl is hidden inside a shell. Here, now, the very shape of the life that holds it and is held by it, inseparable from the matter it organizes, in the way that the impression is inseparable from the wax that received it, the way the sight of things is inseparable from the eye that was always as long as it was an eye, the kind of thing that seeing is the actuality of. The question of the active intellect rests as it has always rested, luminous, open, patient, at the edge of what the philosophy can see, and no further. It does not demand resolution tonight. It has been at that edge for a very long time, and the edge has not moved, and the light in the question has not dimmed, and the way it continues to rest there, unforced and unhurried, is itself a kind of answer, not to the question, but to the urgency that sometimes gathers around the question. The urgency does not belong to it. The question belongs to no particular night and to no particular mind. It continues the way light continues in a room after the eyes have closed, present, quiet, holding the shapes of things that are still there, that will still be there, that have always been precisely where they appear to be. Plato was in his late 60s when he composed the dialogue he set on the last day of Socrates' life. The room was small. The friends had gathered before dawn and stayed through the morning. Outside the prison, the city went about its ordinary affairs, the market filling, the harbor moving, the light of a spring morning laying itself across the harbor road without ceremony or concern. Inside, the hemlock had already been prepared. Socrates sat with his friends and talked about the soul. The Phaedo is a strange document to have survived. It is at once a farewell and a sustained philosophical argument, a record of grief held at a distance by the discipline of careful thought. Plato places in Socrates' mouth the claim that death, for the philosopher, is not something to be feared, not because it is painless or insignificant, but because the soul, properly understood, is the kind of thing that does not end when the body does. The philosopher has spent a lifetime, Socrates says, in a kind of practice for death, a practice of turning the soul away from the body's appetites and distractions toward the eternal objects that the soul alone can fully know. The body clouds, obscures, disturbs. The soul, when it is thinking well, is already somewhere else. The argument Plato builds for this position depends on a single deep conviction about what the soul fundamentally is. Because the soul concerns itself with invisible, unchanging, eternal things, with justice itself, with beauty itself, with the forms that lie behind all particular instances of beautiful or just things. It must be more like those things than like the perishable, changing, visible world it moves through during life. It is an argument from resemblance. The soul is not visible. The forms are not visible. The body passes away. The forms do not pass away. The soul, being of a kind with what does not pass away, must itself belong to a different order of existence than the body it temporarily inhabits. There is a real dignity in this argument. Plato is not simply consoling Socrates, though the occasion demands some consolation. He is making a genuine claim about the structure of reality, that the most knowable, most real, most authoritative things are not the things the senses reach, but the things the mind apprehends in its most disciplined and unclouded operations. The body is a kind of instrument of distraction. Life is a practice of disentanglement. Death, for the philosopher, is the completion of what philosophy has been attempting all along. Plato imagined the soul at death, rising toward the realm of forms, the way smoke rises from a flame, not dispersing, not dissolving, but ascending, returning to the order of things to which it had always, in its deepest nature, belonged. It is a beautiful image. It carries the weight of genuine conviction. Plato held it not as a comforting story, but as the conclusion of arguments he thought were sound, and he returned to the image across many dialogues, across many years of his life, without ever finding a reason to set it aside. Aristotle was in the academy when these arguments were still in circulation, still being tested and refined. He was there for nearly 20 years, long enough to have absorbed every implication of the Platonic picture, long enough to have understood from the inside what it would mean to believe that the most real things are not the things one touches, or sees, or measures, or dissects. He was also the son of a physician, and he had spent enough time in the company of living bodies, animal and human, to know that living things have a way of insisting on their own specificity, that abstract arguments cannot quite accommodate. A particular plant, a particular animal, a particular capacity for movement, for sensation, for growth. These were not pale shadows of something more real elsewhere. They were the things themselves, entire in themselves, asking to be understood on their own terms. It took Aristotle years to find the language for the disagreement. The distance he traveled from the academy to his own position was not covered in a single step, and it would be wrong to think of him simply discarding what he had learned there. The Platonic inheritance runs through every line of his philosophy, in the rigor of his logical method, in the seriousness with which he takes the question of what things essentially are, in his conviction that the soul's highest activity involves a kind of contemplation that reaches towards something permanent. But the direction of the argument reversed. The permanent was not elsewhere. The form was not transcendent. The soul was not a traveler passing through a foreign country called the body. The soul was the very thing the body was when it was organized well enough to be alive. Aristotle pressed his hand flat against the table, as it were, not upward, here, this, the thing itself. The question he placed at the center of his inquiry into the soul was not what the soul most resembles, or what realm it naturally belongs to, but what work the soul does, what difference the soul's presence makes to a body that has it, and what the body becomes when the soul is gone. His answer was built on an analogy that is still worth sitting with. If the eye were an entire living creature, he said, then sight would be its soul, not a second thing housed inside the eye, not an invisible companion sharing the eye's residence, but the capacity that the eye, when it is properly formed and functioning, simply is. The eye without sight is not an eye in any meaningful sense. It is just a shape that resembles an eye. What makes it an eye is what it can do, and what it can do is the soul of the eye, the form of the eye, the actuality toward which the eye's entire material organization is oriented. This is the point where Aristotle and Plato are farthest from each other, and also, in a strange way, closest. Both are asking what makes a thing what it is. Both reach for something beyond the material substrate, some principle of organization, some determining structure, some form. But for Plato, the form is elsewhere, accessible only to the mind that turns away from the body. For Aristotle, the form is here, inseparable from the matter it organizes, not transcendent, but immanent, present not despite the body but through it, and as it. Imagine a fig tree in the garden of the Lyceum in early spring. Aristotle observed fig trees. He watched the way they put out their first leaves after the cold months, the way growth announced itself in small increments before it became visible, the way each new part of the tree expressed the same principle that had been in the seed before the tree existed at all. There was no separate fig tree soul hovering above the material tree, conferring on it its fig treeness from a distance. The soul of the fig tree was the tree in its organized, living, self-maintaining activity. Take away the activity, and what remains is not a fig tree with its soul removed. It is wood, cellulose, moisture, mineral, the matter without the form, the eye without sight. The philosophers who came after both Plato and Aristotle were given a problem that neither had fully resolved, and the problem was this: if Aristotle is right, and the soul is the form of a living body, then when the body dies and the form ceases to organize it, what becomes of the soul? The Platonic answer was clear. The soul was never truly of the body. It belonged elsewhere. It returned to what it had always most resembled. Aristotle's answer was less clear, and he knew it. For most of what he calls the soul, for the nutritive and sensitive capacities, for the faculties of growth and perception and appetite, there seemed to him no question. These do not survive the body's dissolution because they are not the kinds of things that can exist apart from the body they organize. The capacity for sight is not sight, it belongs to an eye. When the eye is gone, the capacity goes with it. But there is one passage in his account of the soul where Aristotle pauses. He has been careful, methodical, empirical. He has worked through every capacity of the living soul and found each one bound to its bodily substrate. And then he arrives at thought, not perception, not imagination, but pure rational thought, and something in his account shifts. The intellect, he says, seems to be a different kind of thing. It does not appear to have a bodily organ in the way that sight has the eye or hearing has the ear. It seems capable, at least in principle, of receiving every intelligible form without being consumed by any of them. And then, almost reluctantly, he goes further. There is something in the intellect, something he calls active or productive, that seems separable, unmixed, impassible. In its essential nature, it is a kind of activity, and this thing, he says, is alone immortal and eternal. He does not explain what this means. He leaves it there, at the edge of his argument, without elaborating. Centuries of careful readers have argued over what he intended, whether this active principle is part of the individual human mind, or something that exceeds it, whether it belongs to each person, or is a single shared light that makes thinking possible for everyone, whether it is God, or simply the impersonal structure of rational intelligibility. Aristotle gave no verdict. He noticed something he could not account for within the framework he had built, and he left the observation where it was, open and unresolved. There is something to learn from the shape of that hesitation. Aristotle was not given to unnecessary mysticism. He was the most systematic thinker of antiquity, a man who built his philosophy from observed particulars upward, who trusted the evidence of careful inquiry, who was impatient with arguments that leaped too quickly to invisible conclusions. And yet here, at the very edge of his account of the soul, he found something that did not fit neatly into the framework his careful work had constructed. He did not force it to fit. He did not discard it because it was inconvenient. He named it and left it open. The divergence between Plato and Aristotle is not simply a disagreement about the soul. It is a divergence that runs all the way down to the ground of each philosopher's understanding of what exists, what can be known, and what knowing is. For Plato, the most authoritative knowledge is the knowledge that turns away from the senses, the vision of the forms that belongs to the rational soul in its purest operation. What the senses deliver is opinion, approximation, shadow. Real knowledge is the soul's reacquaintance with what it already knew before it entered the body, a recollection, not a discovery, a remembering of what was always there, beneath the noise of sensory life. Aristotle found this picture deeply unsatisfying, not because it was obviously wrong, but because it left too much out. The knowledge that comes from watching a living creature over time, from following its growth through each stage, from noting how it responds to its environment, from attending to the specific differences between one kind of living thing and another. This was not shadow knowledge for Aristotle. It was the beginning of understanding. All knowledge begins with perception, he insisted. Perception becomes memory. Memory becomes experience. Experience becomes the material from which reason draws its universal principles. The soul's ascent is not a departure from the sensory world. It is the careful gathering and organization of what the sensory world offers, elevated by thought into something that can be held and examined and applied. This disagreement about where knowledge comes from, about whether the senses help or hinder the soul's best work, is not merely epistemological. It reaches into the deepest questions about what a human being is. If Plato is right, then the body is fundamentally in tension with the soul's proper activity. The body wants, desires, distracts, obscures. The soul wants to contemplate, to know, to ascend. The life of the philosopher is a life of managed tension between these two, a practice carried on across years of learning to live in the body without being wholly determined by it, of finding in the discipline of thought a kind of freedom that the body alone cannot provide. If Aristotle is right, there is no such fundamental tension. The body and soul are not opponents. They are aspects of a single living being, each requiring the other, neither complete without the other's presence. The body's capacities, sensation, appetite, pleasure, pain, are not obstacles to the soul's proper activity. They are the medium through which the soul's activity unfolds. A human being who has been well formed, who has developed the right habits of perception and feeling and practical judgment, is not a soul struggling free of a body. A human being who has been well formed is simply, wholly, well alive. Raphael painted them both. The fresco in the Vatican Library, a gathering of all the philosophers antiquity had produced, arranged in a great architectural space that seemed to open toward sky, places Plato and Aristotle at the center. Plato points upward, toward what cannot be seen. Aristotle extends his hand, palm down toward the earth, toward what is here. It is not a verdict. Raphael was not deciding between them. He was acknowledging that these two gestures, toward the invisible and toward the visible, toward the eternal and toward the present, toward the form and toward the formed thing, represent genuine orientations toward the real, both of them arising from the same love of wisdom, both of them pointing at something that the other gesture, taken alone, cannot reach. The image has endured because it is honest. There is no synthesis available that preserves the full force of both positions. A philosopher who wants to follow Plato all the way is committed to a world in which the most real things are not the things around us. A philosopher who wants to follow Aristotle all the way is committed to a world in which the soul's life is inseparable from the body's life, and in which whatever the soul can do, it does here, in the particular and the perishable. These are not positions that can be fully reconciled. They can be held side by side, illuminating each other, each revealing what the other obscures, and this is perhaps the more honest relationship to maintain with them, as Raphael maintained it, without forcing a resolution that neither tradition would recognize. Medieval philosophers inherited both. Thomas Aquinas, working in his cell in the 13th century, was reading Aristotle in Latin translation, translations made from Arabic translations, the text having traveled from Greek through Syriac through Arabic before arriving in the Latin West by a long and unlikely route. Aquinas found in Aristotle's hylomorphic account of the soul a framework that could be made compatible with Christian theology in ways that the Platonic account had never quite managed. The soul as form of the body gave the soul an intimate, constitutive relationship to the flesh that made resurrection, the resurrection of the body, specifically, not merely the soul's survival, philosophically intelligible. If the soul is the form of the body, then soul and body together constitute the whole human being, and a soul without its body is in Aquinas's understanding an incomplete and in some sense impoverished thing. A form without the matter, it is the form of. This was a strange and productive reversal. Aristotle, who had questioned whether the soul could survive the body at all, had provided the philosophical tools for a theology that insisted on the soul's intimate dependence on the body, and this dependence, rather than undermining the hope of resurrection, turned out to support it. What survives, what is raised, what continues, is not the soul escaping the body, but the whole person reconstituted. Aquinas was reading Aristotle carefully, but he was also pressing the text toward questions Aristotle had not asked, and finding in it answers Aristotle had not given. Across the Mediterranean, in Cordoba, Averroes had been reading the same text decades earlier with different questions in mind. He believed the active intellect Aristotle described, the separable, unmixed, immortal principle, was not individual, not personal, not the property of any particular human soul, but a single shared principle that existed separately from all individual minds, while making each of them capable of genuine thought. When a human being thinks, on this reading, they do not produce thought from within themselves. They participate in a principle of thought that precedes them, transcends them, and will continue when they are gone. Each particular mind is a kind of temporary aperture through which a universal light passes. The argument was philosophically coherent, and it troubled theologians who required personal immortality, the survival of this particular soul with its particular history, rather than the impersonal continuation of an intellectual principle in which each soul had briefly shared. But what it preserved was something else, the sense that thought, at its most universal, is not the private possession of any individual. When a mind arrives at a genuine truth, not an opinion, not a habit, not a preference, but an actual truth about the nature of things, it is not reporting something about itself. It is participating in something larger. Averroes heard in Aristotle's hesitation at the edge of his account of the active intellect, something that pointed in this direction, and he followed it there with complete seriousness. What is striking, across these varied readings, is not that they disagreed profoundly, but that they all return to the same place in the same text. The passage in De Anima, where Aristotle pauses before the active intellect and says something he cannot fully account for, drew commentators from across centuries and traditions, each finding in the pause a different kind of invitation. Aristotle had not known what to say, and the not knowing had turned out to be as generative as any of the clear answers he had given elsewhere. Plato's Phaedo ends with Socrates calmly refusing the sympathy of his friends, declining to be told it is hard, and dying with what the text describes as composure, the composure not of someone who has stopped caring, but of someone who has thought about this long enough and carefully enough that the urgency has drained out of the question, leaving only the question itself, open and oddly inhabitable. His friends wept. Socrates did not. The distinction the dialogue draws between these two responses is not callousness on Socrates' part. It is the product of a lifetime of sustained philosophical attention to the question that was now, on this particular morning, becoming not hypothetical. Aristotle never faced that morning in that way. He died in Chalcis, away from Athens, the year after Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He had been forced to leave Athens again. There were charges, as there had been charges against Socrates, and he chose exile over martyrdom. He is reported to have said that he did not wish to give Athens the opportunity to sin twice against philosophy. It is a dry remark, the remark of a man who was not performing equanimity, but simply had it. He left. He continued working. He died still writing, or at least still thinking. The records are partial, as records of endings usually are. What both men left behind was not a settled answer, but a sustained way of attending to the question. The soul for Plato is something the world cannot quite contain, something that exceeds whatever body it passes through, that belongs to a different order of existence, that carries its highest nature toward forms of life. the visible world only partially and imperfectly expresses. The soul, for Aristotle, is something the world completely contains, not diminishingly, not imprisoningly, but constitutively, the way the shape of water is contained in the river that carries it, or the way the capacity for music is contained in the instrument that properly played produces it. Neither answer closes the question. This is not a failure of either answer. It is the nature of the question. There is a way in which the disagreement between Plato and Aristotle on the soul is not a disagreement that could in principle be resolved, even by a sufficiently patient and careful philosopher working with all the available evidence. It is a disagreement about what the most important things are, about whether the permanent or the particular, the transcendent or the immanent, the form that could in principle be elsewhere, or the form that can only be here, deserves to be called most real. And this is not a question that observations can settle, or that arguments alone can settle, because the disagreement is precisely about what counts as a good argument and what counts as relevant evidence. Plato's soul looks toward the forms and finds in their unchanging nature the closest thing to home it can recognize. Aristotle's soul looks at the living world and finds in its organized, purposive, self-maintaining activity the most persuasive evidence available for what the soul is. Both are looking carefully. Both are seeing something real. What they cannot see from their respective positions is what the other position reveals, and this may be the deepest reason why both have survived, why both are still read, why the image of one pointing upward and the other pointing down continues to hold something that neither gesture alone would hold. The question of what makes a living thing alive has not been settled. It has been refined, elaborated, approached from new directions, reformulated in the language of modern biology and neuroscience and philosophy of mind, and still, at the point where the refinements end, the same question is waiting, not menacingly, not impatiently, the way a river is waiting beneath ice in winter, present, unhurried, carrying its ancient weight forward through the cold months toward whatever open ground comes next. A medieval scholar, sitting with a Latin translation of Aristotle's De Anima, late in the night, reading the definition of the soul for the first time as an adult who had already formed a settled picture of what the soul must be, that scholar would have paused at the sentence, the first actuality of a natural body that has the potential for life. Not a ghost, not a traveler, not an imprisoned divine spark, the form of the body, the very thing the body is when it is organized well enough to be alive. The scholar reads the sentence again, not because it is confusing, but because it requires a different kind of attention than the sentences that came before it, the attention of someone standing at the edge of a new country, taking in the shape of the land before deciding whether to step forward. Aristotle's account of the soul does not make the soul less remarkable. That is the misunderstanding most likely to arise on a first encounter with the hylomorphic framework. The feeling that if the soul is just the form of the body, just the way a living body is organized, then something has been taken away, some depth or dignity has been lost. But the form of a living body is not a simple thing. It is an organizing principle of extraordinary complexity, capable of taking in nourishment and converting it into continued life, capable of perceiving a world that exceeds in richness what any single organism could fully absorb, capable of feeling hunger and warmth and the texture of rain, capable of memory and imagination and the slow, patient work of trying to understand what things are. All of this is the form,